I mean, I completely see what you're saying, and I remember the first time I ever heard about the kulaks, and that really woke me up. In fact, I was probably 2 years into working at Monsanto. I had heard the story of the kulaks, and the parallel that I drew was people that are saying GMOs are poison or organic farming is safe and the other ones aren't, are putting us in a really bad spot, particularly the corporations that are selling into this system. Because what they're doing is they're taking money and making it off of this fear that people have of like, hey, maybe our food is poisoned or it's not safe. And then what are you going to do if that fear really starts on fire? If you have somebody come to power that says this is the only way we're going to do it. And I still feel like that's a grave danger in our society. I also think the idea that scientists, I believe we run a very real risk of saying we should have all of our decisions based on science, and we start moving towards a scientism, a sort of religious movement that says that science can tell us more than just what is true or is not true, but it also should tell us what we ought to do about it. I think they call it Hume's guillotine, right? Where it's saying this is what the science says is safe, and so therefore we can use that to determine what we ought to do on some large scale. So I'm always like this tension I didn't used to have, and now I do, because I think we're watching what happens when science gets turned into a religion and people start fighting over ideology when one side perceives we're fighting over truth, but that's every religious fight.
That's right. And I think that scientific ideas, scientific discussions, most recently have been demonstrated to be certain ideologies. If you were on one side or the other, instead of having a reasonable scientific discussion between the people who are defending the use of one thing versus another, in COVID, for example, or people having a reasonable discussion, they got railroaded into one or the other sides, and a whole lot of mistrust built up around those sides. And you, depending on where you stood on hydroxychloroquine versus vaccination versus ivermectin, you're, instead of having a reasonable discussion where people come to a consensus together and build trust, you got automatically labeled as a fascist or a communist. So it's really, I think, for the public to watch this debacle happen at the scientific level is really disconcerting, and they don't know who to believe anymore.
Yeah, 100%. I remember it was a couple of years ago. I don't know if it was The Daily Show or if it was like one of these late night shows. And they did this demonstration where they said, here are 99 people in a band and one that is not in the band. He's playing off on his own. And because these 99 are so loud and they play so well together, this represents the consensus on climate change. And so you're either with the 99 band players or you're this one person over here. And that, like, it really made me angry.
Yeah.
And it really made me be like, you know what? I don't want to be on your team if the way that you're going to win this argument is by saying, look at all the people that agree with us, and whatever this one person's point is, not only are we not going to listen to it, but you should drown them out. You should literally play your music so loud that there's no chance. Because it's like, what if that guy brings a good point to this discussion? What if in his disagreeability, like, he brings something up that nobody considered? Without that guy, bad things can happen.
So one of the things that I think you see with the 99 is you get into a lot of credentialism, from Ivy League schools and things like that. I like to point out that Harvard, it's a great school, led the charge, though, with their for lobotomy in the 50s.
Did they really?
Yes, they did. So yeah, there was the dream team saying this is the way, Walter Freeman, Harvey Cushing, all these people saying that this is the absolute way to manage, psychiatric illness. And that's why, Rose Kennedy got lobotomized and devastated. Frances Farmer, who is a Hollywood starlet, got lobotomized, wrecked. So very well-heeled, credentialed people often make large recommendations, sweeping recommendations that are then taken to be the gospel truth because of their credentials. And in retrospect, you're like, whoa. So
it's a weird thing, right? Like, I don't really understand why people started moving towards the we should only have one side of the discussion, the other side is completely wrong. And I have to wonder, is this like the natural state of human beings, and that like the concept of free speech being like a social technology that we discovered, but it would entirely be possible that we could lose that social technology?
Yeah, that to me is terrifying. I think that it's really important for people to be able to say what they think, and you may disagree 100% with it, but there has to be room for a discussion, because otherwise you can't come to a reasonable conclusion without hearing both sides of the story. And regardless of what you think is morally correct, you may have a completely different moral background, but that doesn't mean that the other person doesn't have the right to say or explain what he or she is thinking.
Yeah, and there's like with corporations, there's like a weird tension, because on the one hand, you're like, hey, a corporation is a group of people. So if you take a political position on something, corporation, you are inherently biasing towards some percentage of your employees and not others. But then on the other hand, you don't want to make it so corporations can't put in their position on something, because somebody like Fred Perlak, who invented or helped be a part of the team to invent BT cotton, which saved all sorts of lives and limited the amount of pesticides. So I don't know how you balance these two things, because to me it seems like I really don't want the power of corporations to be able to have their voice so outweigh other people, but on the other hand, they have to be a part of the conversation, because if you limit them out of it, then the only people that are talking are the activists or the end line consumers or something.
Yep, and I think that's a really difficult balance for corporations to walk, because they're always accused of one thing or the other, right? Having conflicts of interest and a whole variety of things. So I think that it's important, though, for corporations to do what they do best, which is make a product that people want. As long and the regulatory apparatus around them are supposed to keep them in that lane in terms of safety and things like that. So we have built in ways for corporations to behave. Now, I'm not going to say that all corporations have always, behaved honorably. Obviously not. But I think that we do have. At the moment, we've got one of the best regulatory systems in the world and the safest food supply in the world. And, and it's because of that balance that people have tried to keep over the past couple of decades. I'm afraid that that's at risk of going away. And then you get corporations actually having to sort of, take a moral tone, as opposed to have a regulatory body, have the corporation do what its job is to do, make a product that people want, a regulatory apparatus that governs that to make sure that those products are safe. And then the consumer, it's the best of both worlds. The consumer gets the best product out there, and people there's a safety mechanism built into that. What we've got now is we've got, regulation by litigation and regulation. So you've got somebody who says, I've got this one paper that shows that this might be a problem, and that gets in front of a jury, and then everybody that gets kind of misinformation can get spread everywhere. Or regulation by legislation, where somebody comes to a legislator and says, I've read this paper, it concerns me. And then, you've got a huge imbalance between what is important and the regulatory apparatus that's designed by thousands of scientists looking at thousands of papers to make sure the products on the market are safe.
When I was working for Monsanto, and there would be activists that would show up, right? So I would sometimes get, not really yelled at, but definitely like some high tension you're representing, this awful corporation. One of the things that I would always point out to them is, as an activist, you really ought to be careful, because in some ways what you're doing by hammering on the table saying, though we need more regulation to protect us from these evil corporations, you are actually helping the largest of corporations to dominate, because the corporations will say, oh, do you want us to take on another maybe 2-3 years of regulation? Just add on $1 million a year. That's fine, because all you're doing is making a moat that gets larger and larger. So if you want to have a startup, you have to have $13 million just to get in the door for the regulations. And so you can't. And so anytime you get a new technology, the only thing you can do is sell it to the people that have already figured out the regulatory apparatus.
That's exactly right. So small business owners have a really hard time, or academics have a very hard time, making that leap. So you've got very interesting products that are stuck on a shelf in a lab because universities are not equipped to take on that regulatory mechanism. So for a pesticide, it costs about $250 million and 10 years of research on safety and safety testing.
$250 million just on safety research.
Yeah.
Okay.
To get to the market, to put together the whole dossier for it to be approved to get on the market. So an incredible amount of testing goes into every pesticide that's been on the market. And in fact, that's why you tend to find not such a huge pipeline of pesticides. Most pesticides are, 20, 30, 40 years old. And because of the amount of safety studies that you have to do to get it on the market. Same thing with pharmaceuticals. I think pharmaceutical testing is closer to $1 billion to get it on the market. And they all are undergoing testing that is called good laboratory practice, or GLP studies, where they do a battery of safety studies that are designed by the regulatory agencies, that are monitored by the regulatory agencies. They can go into your lab and make sure you're following all the rules. If you have an adverse effect, that is reportable by law to the regulatory agency. So a mouse dies, that gets reported to the EPA here. A mouse gets wobbly, that gets reported to the EPA. Somebody drinks your pesticide after it's on the market, that gets reported to the EPA. So it's a very, very... The reason why it's so strict is because you want to make sure that what your studies show are reproducible over and over and over and over again. And academic labs aren't set up to do that. They're set up to explore new ideas and exciting ideas for treating diseases or things like that. But they don't have that kind of capital to invest in the regulations that they actually are demanding, which is reasonable. It's reasonable to make sure that there are solid regulations around a product.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you like this interview, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and hit that bell so you always get notified about this podcast. And if you're really interested in conversations like this, you may want to consider joining the Articulate Ventures Network. To find out more, go to network.articulate.ventures.